Imagine this. You walk into a room and the energy shifts, not because you raised your voice, not because you demanded attention, but because your presence now holds a weight, a silent gravity, the kind that makes people pause, the kind that makes those who once underestimated you wonder what changed. We live in a world where noise is power, shouting the loudest, posting the most, reacting faster than anyone else. But what if true power isn't loud at all? What if it lives in silence? You see, when someone disrespects you, your first instinct might be to clap back, explain yourself, prove your worth, put them in their place, because let's be honest, that fire in your chest feels righteous. But here's the truth most never tell you. Your silence is louder than any retaliation could ever be. And silence, it's not about doing nothing. It's about doing something they never saw coming. You stop showing up for people who only call when they need something. You stop replying to messages that drain your soul. You stop giving away your energy like it's free. That is the first silent move of a wise person. Let me ask you this. Have you ever had someone take you for granted, and instead of arguing or begging for their attention, you simply stopped showing up, stopped talking, stopped engaging, and suddenly they're left in a room full of their own echoes, wondering why the air feels colder now? That's not weakness, that's presence, that's power. In Zen Buddhism, we are taught that a calm mind is not something you find. It's something you build, moment by moment, thought by thought, and sometimes brick by brick through pain. The Buddha never needed to shout to be heard. His stillness was the thunder. His gaze was the storm. So here's the truth no one wants to hear: those who hurt you don't regret your anger, they regret your absence. They don't fear your confrontation, they fear your peace. And when you finally stop chasing closure, stop needing validation, stop playing the emotional tug-of-war, you begin to rise. That's when people start noticing. But by then, it's too late. They lost access, not because you slammed the door, but because you quietly closed it and kept walking. And here's the beauty: you didn't walk away in hate. You walked away in wholeness. You chose to protect your peace, instead of trying to make someone understand your worth. And that is what this journey is all about. This is not a guide to revenge. This is not about proving anything to anyone. This is about reclaiming your power in silence, living in a way that speaks louder than words, healing in ways they will never see, and becoming someone they never expected you could be. Because once you start honoring your energy, you stop explaining it. So take a breath, close your eyes, and imagine what it would feel like to live so fully in your own peace that even your absence teaches people how to treat you. That's the power of stillness. That's the strength of silence. And that is the quiet path to power. It begins not with a confrontation, but with a quiet decision. You decide to pull back, not out of spite, not out of pride, but out of wisdom, because here's the truth. The most powerful move you will ever make is simply stopping the energy, stopping the effort, stopping the endless giving to those who would never bleed for you the way you bled for them. You don't send a warning. You don't craft a dramatic exit. You just stop. And suddenly, the silence you leave behind becomes deafening. They start to notice your absence in ways they never noticed your presence. You used to respond right away. Now they wait. You used to say yes out of habit. Now there's a boundary. You used to show up even when you were breaking inside. Now you choose to heal, alone, and they feel it. Let me tell you something from Buddhist teaching. What you feed grows. And so, when you stop feeding the bond, when you stop pouring yourself into a cracked vessel, you no longer grow resentment. You grow clarity. This is the first silent move. You withdraw your energy, not to punish, but to preserve. You were not born to carry what others refuse to hold. Your kindness is not a contract. Your presence is not a promise. So when someone disrespects you, don't light a fire hoping they'll feel the heat. Walk away and let them feel the cold. They won't understand at first. They'll call it moodiness, accuse you of acting distant, wonder where the old you went, but you know where that version went. It died the moment you realized. Your energy was not appreciated, only expected. You see, in Zen, there is a concept. Non-doing is not idleness. It is the action of not reacting. You're not withdrawing because you gave up. You're withdrawing because you woke up. And when you do, when you stop calling, stop explaining, stop being emotionally available to those who see your heart as convenient, they panic, not because they miss your words, but because they can no longer use your warmth to heat their cold world. You were the light switch they flipped whenever they felt darkness, but now that switch no longer responds. And that silence, it speaks a language they forgot how to hear. It says, I no longer serve where I am not seen. I no longer water what is dry by choice. I no longer stand where I am not welcomed. And what follows is a kind of silence that breaks louder than any scream. Let me take you to a story. A Zen monk once had a friend who only came to the temple when life collapsed. Again and again, the monk offered his time, his tea, his teaching. But one day, the monk simply closed the door. No anger, no sermon, just silence. The friend knocked. No answer. Came back the next day. No answer. Weeks passed. Still silence. Then the friend finally returned, this time with a bowed head, offering gratitude, not demands, and the monk welcomed him in. What changed? The friend had felt the weight of absence. Only in that silence did he realize what he had lost. So remember this, when you withdraw your energy, you're not ending something. You're beginning something far more sacred. Self-respect, self-healing, self-liberation. You don't need to announce your boundaries. You just need to live them. And when your energy no longer surrounds those who mishandled it, they will feel that shift, and some will regret. But that's not your burden to carry. Your only task is to protect your flame from those who come not to warm their hands, but to burn you down. They say silence speaks volumes, but absence echoes. When you're no longer present in someone's life, in a room, in a conversation, what remains is not emptiness, but a reflection. A mirror held up to the world you stepped away from. You see, most people think that withdrawing is about vanishing. But in truth, when you remove yourself with quiet intent, not from spite, not from drama, but from clarity, something fascinating happens. The energy you once gave begins to speak in your place. And that energy, it reveals the truth. Take this in for a moment. When you stop showing up, you don't disappear. You reveal who was truly listening, who was pretending, who relied on your light but never acknowledged the warmth, and who deep down never saw you at all. Absence is not passive. It's an active mirror. It reveals loyalty, exposes dependence, uncovers false intimacy. People begin to show their truest colors when there is no one left to perform for, no one to impress, no audience to validate their illusion. Your absence doesn't just reflect them. It also reflects you. It becomes a silent teacher, guiding you through the maze of your own attachments. Suddenly, you can see where you poured too much of yourself into hollow spaces, where you mistook attention for affection, and where your own silence was the most honest answer you ever gave. Absence teaches you the weight of your presence. Think of it like this. The more deeply rooted a tree is in the ground, the more noticeable its fall. And the more emotionally present a person has been, the louder their absence echoes. If you ever feel unappreciated, don't argue, don't explain, don't try to prove your worth. Withdraw. Let absence do what presence couldn't. Let it ring in the rooms you used to fill. Let it whisper into the ears of those who took you for granted. Let it stir in the minds of those who confused your kindness for weakness. Let it make them uncomfortable. That discomfort. It's the truth finally knocking. It's fascinating what people say when you're not around, but it's even more revealing what they feel when you're gone. Not everyone deserves your time. Not everyone has earned the intimacy of your presence. And not every connection is worth the noise. So here's a quiet truth. When you become less available, you become more powerful. That's not arrogance. That's awareness. In the dance of human interaction, stepping back often tells you more than stepping forward ever could. Because absence, when chosen, not forced, transforms you into a mirror, and what you see reflected may just set you free. They underestimated you. They thought your silence was surrender, your withdrawal weakness, your absence an ending. But what they didn't see was the becoming. Because the most powerful transformations don't happen under the spotlight. They happen in silence, in solitude, in the private hours when no one's watching, when no one's clapping, and when no one cares but you. This is the silent glow-up, the kind that doesn't beg for attention because it's too busy evolving. You didn't announce your growth. You didn't make a post about cutting people off. You didn't perform your healing for social media. You simply disappeared and did the work. You confronted your shadows. You faced the uncomfortable truths. You sat in rooms where the silence was deafening, and still you stayed. Not because it was easy, but because deep down you knew no one is coming to save you. And that realization, that was the ignition. You stopped chasing validation. Stopped handing out explanations. Stopped shrinking yourself to fit into containers too small for your spirit. You began eating better, thinking clearer, moving differently. You started reading, meditating, praying, breathing. You learned to sit with your discomfort without numbing it. And you embraced the quiet pain of transformation because you finally saw it for what it was. Proof that something inside you was being reborn. People won't understand how you did it because they didn't see the struggle. They didn't hear the internal wars. They didn't witness the nights you cried in silence but still woke up and chose yourself anyway. That's the beauty of the silent glow-up. It confuses those who thought they had you figured out. They'll say you changed, that you're distant now, harder to reach, more guarded, but the truth is, you didn't build walls, you built boundaries, you didn't close off, you refined access. And while they were busy watching others, talking, judging, scrolling, you were growing, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. So now your energy speaks before you do. Your peace is your power, and your glow, it's no longer for them, it's for you. The body has changed. The eyes are clearer. The presence is deeper. You walk with intention, you speak with precision, you love with discernment, no announcement, no performance, just results. This is the season where you no longer explain who you are, you embody it. You've turned your silence into strategy, your solitude into strength, and your stillness into a sanctuary. So to those who thought you were fading, let them look again. You didn't disappear. You evolved, you didn't go quiet, you recalibrated, and now you shine. Without saying a single word. They poke you, they test you, they provoke you, and they wait for the reaction, because the moment you react, they win. You see, the world thrives on noise, arguments, outrage, opinions shouted over opinions. But silence unsettles. When you don't react, you take away their weapon. When you don't react, you become untouchable. The ego always wants the last word. The soul, however, prefers peace over being right. When you live from the ego, every insult feels personal. Every disagreement feels like a threat. But when you evolve beyond that need to defend, to be understood, to be right, you unlock an extraordinary power. The power to move not out of emotion but out of wisdom. Most people go through life emotionally hijacked. They hear something disrespectful, they explode, they get overlooked, they sulk. They're triggered, they lash out. That's not power. That's slavery to the nervous system. But evolution happens in the pause. That moment between stimulus and response, that sacred space, is where transformation lives. It's where you say, I see what's happening here, but I don't have to dance in this storm. Imagine someone throws a rock into a still lake. The surface ripples for a while, but if you don't throw another, it calms again. That's your mind. That's your energy. That's your life. The moment you choose not to react, you shift from chaos to clarity. And here's the beauty. When people realize they can't get a reaction out of you, they change how they treat you. They either level up to meet your energy or quietly remove themselves from your life. You stop being their entertainment. You stop being their emotional dump yard. You stop being predictable. Stillness becomes your superpower. Detachment becomes your discipline, and people begin to feel something different when they're around you. It's not arrogance. It's not indifference. It's calm authority. It's evolution in real time. So the next time someone tries to provoke you, remember, your silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. It's self-mastery. It's a declaration. I do not lower myself to chaos. I rise above it. Don't react, evolve. Because your greatest revenge is elevation. And sometimes the loudest message you can ever send is no message at all. Just your graceful growth, your quiet peace, and your refusal to be shaken by a world that feeds on noise. As you embody this, you'll notice something magical. Your inner peace becomes contagious. Your energy becomes mysterious. And your path becomes clear, not because you shouted louder, but because you listened deeper. You didn't fight back. You didn't explain yourself. You just kept rising, and that is when the world finally starts to pay attention. A lion doesn't need to roar to claim its territory. It just stands tall. In a world addicted to over-explaining, oversharing, and over-apologizing, there's a rare kind of power in the one who simply says, no. No drama. No justification. No raised voice. Just calm, clear, unshakable. You don't need to scream to be heard. You don't need to fight to be respected. You don't need to cut people off with anger when you can let them drift away with silence. Real boundaries aren't walls. They're invisible lines drawn with quiet strength. They don't need neon signs. They don't need announcements. They need only to be lived. When you evolve, you start protecting your peace the way royalty guards a crown, not with paranoia, but with presence. You realize that every yes to others is a no to yourself if it costs your energy, your clarity, your purpose. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Some people will only love you when they can use you. They'll call you difficult when you stop being easy to manipulate. They'll label you cold when you stop carrying their emotional baggage. Let them. Let them misunderstand you. Let them gossip. Let them walk. Because your job is not to keep the peace outside. Your job is to protect the peace inside. Setting boundaries doesn't make you cruel. Explaining them over and over again, on the other hand, drains your soul. So stop explaining your growth to people committed to staying small. You don't have to answer every message. You don't have to attend every invitation. You don't have to absorb every complaint. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back, not to punish, but to protect, not to control, but to conserve. It's in this silence that your standards echo loudest. You don't beg, you don't chase, you don't convince. You just become so rooted in self-worth that anything not aligned falls away naturally. No fight, no fuss, just release. When you say no without guilt, when you step back without fear, when you honor your space without conflict, you finally understand what self-respect truly feels like. Because true boundaries are spiritual. They say, my energy is sacred. My time is precious. My peace is non-negotiable. You don't need to slam doors. You simply close them gently and lock them with love. So if you've ever been called too quiet, too distant, or too selfish lately, smile. You're not becoming cold. You're becoming clear. Clear about what you need. Clear about what you'll tolerate. Clear about what your soul refuses to carry any longer. That's not ego. That's evolution. So remember this. You don't have to raise your voice to be firm. You don't have to harden your heart to be strong. You just need to know who you are and act accordingly. Boundaries are not barriers. They are bridges built in silence for only those who know how to walk with respect. And the moment you master the art of setting boundaries without noise, you stop managing people's expectations and start commanding your own peace. When the world spins in chaos, when voices rise and tempers flare, there is one person in the room who holds true power, not the loudest, not the boldest, but the calmest. That person radiates something invisible yet undeniable. Control, presence, peace. And that right there is the superpower of calmness. It doesn't shout, it doesn't force, it doesn't beg to be noticed. It simply stands still, grounded, unshaken. In a world obsessed with reaction, calmness is rebellion. And not the kind of passive, everything's fine surface calm. No, this is a deep, earned serenity. The kind that grows when you've stared chaos in the face and said, "You don't control me anymore." Think about it. When someone insults you, what's your first urge? Retaliate, defend, explain. But when you rise above that reflex and stay composed, you instantly disarm the situation. You become unpredictable. You break the script. Your calmness becomes unsettling in the best way. It sends a message. I'm not at war with you. I'm at peace with myself. You see, true calmness isn't the absence of feeling. It's the mastery of it. The ability to feel deeply but not be owned by those feelings. To witness your emotions like waves, knowing they'll pass. To observe your thoughts like clouds, letting them drift. And it's not just about looking cool or feeling spiritual. Calmness is practical, tactical. It keeps you clear-headed in negotiations. It prevents you from saying things you'll regret. It helps you stay focused when everyone else is panicking. Calm people make better decisions because their judgment isn't hijacked by fear or ego. And here's the truth. Most people have never experienced calmness that isn't boring. But what you're building here isn't dullness. It's dangerous stillness. The kind that makes people pause around you. The kind that carries weight. The kind that makes others wonder what you know that they don't. There's a Buddhist teaching that says, "Be like a mountain. Let the wind of the world blow past you." Not because you're numb, but because you're rooted. When you're calm, you're no longer swayed by gossip, by jealousy, by need for approval. You no longer chase noise. You draw power from the silence. And that silence speaks louder than anything you could ever say. In ancient samurai traditions, warriors trained not just in swordsmanship, but in stillness. Their greatest strength wasn't in how fast they could strike, but how long they could wait without blinking. That kind of composure can shake even the most confident opponent. You want to become magnetic? Be calm. You want people to respect your presence? Be calm. You want to heal your nervous system, protect your peace, and make better choices for your future? Be calm, because calmness is no longer optional. It's the armor of the modern warrior. While others drown in their reactions, you breathe. While they rush, you move with intention. While they seek attention, you become attention itself. And what's beautiful is, calmness isn't something you find, it's something you build, moment by moment, breath by breath. It's a discipline, a decision. And every time you choose not to react, you choose to evolve. And when you walk into a room with that kind of energy, everyone feels it, without a word. Because true power doesn't need a microphone, it just needs stillness. And now, as we move deeper into this path of silent power, we begin to explore something that seems simple on the surface, but is often the hardest lesson to master. When and how to disappear, Not out of fear, but out of strength. You don't have to chase justice. You don't have to prove your worth. You don't even need to correct every misunderstanding or call out every slight. Because here's the truth. Karma sees what you didn't say. It hears what you chose not to explain. And it remembers what you forgave but never forgot. When you understand the silent mechanisms of karma, you stop wasting energy trying to control outcomes or people. You stop scrambling to be seen, to be validated, to be avenged. Instead, you begin to move through life with quiet precision. You trust the invisible currents that always bring balance, not on your schedule, but on the universe's. You've been taught to fight for your place, to speak louder when you're overlooked, to be louder, tougher, stronger. But true strength is the one that leans back, not forward. It's the kind that doesn't push, doesn't plead, just watches, and lets karma do what karma does best. Because no act of harm goes unnoticed. No lie goes unbalanced. No betrayal escapes the ledger of the universe. What you give out, your intentions, your words, your choices, they echo longer than your voice. Sometimes people wonder how the quietest person in the room ends up with the most peace, the most success, the clearest path forward. It's because they stopped playing checkers and started watching the board like it's chess. Karma is always moving, and when you understand that, you don't need revenge, you need patience. You don't need to burn bridges. Just build better ones for yourself and walk away, silently. You don't need to explain your boundaries. Your absence will speak volumes. And when others try to provoke you, trap you, diminish you, you evolve out of their frequency. You rise above their noise. Because here's the secret no one tells you. Those who live loudly must constantly defend themselves. But those who move with quiet alignment, they don't need defense. The universe defends them. It's not magic. It's the math of moral balance. So when someone lies about you, let karma do the talking. When someone mocks your peace, let karma deliver the lesson. When they walk away thinking they won, let karma show them what real loss looks like. Your job is to remain anchored, not reactive but reflective, not petty but powerful. Don't clap back, don't seek approval, don't rush the process. Because when you carry clean energy, life eventually clears the path for you. No noise required. Remember, karma works better than you do, and when you learn to trust it fully, you'll finally be free from the burden of fixing what was never yours to fix. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all, just the sound of your footsteps, moving forward. While the past deals with itself, there comes a moment in life, not always loud or dramatic, when you just vanish, not in fear, not in bitterness, but with elegance. Disappearing with dignity is one of the rarest forms of power. It's the choice to remove yourself not because you've lost, but because you've outgrown. Because staying would cost your peace, and leaving reclaims it. There's something hauntingly beautiful about a person who doesn't announce their departure. They simply stop showing up physically, emotionally, energetically. No noise, no mess, just absence. And in that silence, their presence speaks louder than ever before. It takes wisdom to know when to leave, and courage to actually walk away. Maybe it's a friendship that once felt like home, but now drains your spirit. Maybe it's a career you climbed for years, only to realize the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. Maybe it's a relationship full of shared memories, but also quiet resentments, missed connections, and constant emotional acrobatics. Staying in something just because you've invested time in it, that's not loyalty, that's fear. Fear of starting over, fear of judgment, fear of being misunderstood. But listen, disappearing isn't about running away. It's about choosing peace. It's an inner declaration that you no longer need validation to justify your decision. The world may label it as giving up, but you'll know better. you'll feel better. Because true dignity isn't in winning every battle, it's in knowing which ones aren't worth fighting. When you disappear with dignity, you don't need closure. You don't need a final conversation or a grand explanation. Because people who truly understood your worth would never have put you in a position where you had to choose between them and yourself. So you let the unanswered texts remain unanswered. You let the invites go unopened. You stop explaining your silence and start embracing its clarity. It's not cold. It's not cruel. It's sacred. Here's what most people don't understand. Disappearing with dignity isn't passive. It's an active recentering of your energy. You begin to live for real. You water your soul. You find joy in the small things again. Cooking a meal slowly, walking without a destination, laughing alone at a dumb meme on your phone. You start noticing how light enters your room at 8 a.m. You hear birds again. You feel your heartbeat. And for the first time in forever, you're not trying to prove anything to anyone. That's when healing begins. There's a common myth that people who walk away are broken. But sometimes, the most whole people are the ones who walk away first. Because they sense when something is no longer aligned with their becoming. You don't leave to hurt them. You leave because staying would hurt you. And slowly, the people who were once confused by your exit will begin to understand. Not through your words, but through your evolution. Through the way you no longer flinch at what once destroyed you. When you disappear with dignity, you don't announce your glow-up. You don't post cryptic quotes. You don't shade them with subtle jabs. You just evolve in silence. And one day they'll see your life and wonder, was I the storm she outgrew? Was I the silence he needed to find himself again? They'll wonder, and that's enough. You don't owe them anything more. Now understand this. Disappearing doesn't always mean disappearing forever. Sometimes it means disappearing until your soul catches up with your body, until your spirit feels strong again, until your boundaries aren't just wishes but walls. And when, or if you return, it's not from a place of lack, but from a place of light. In Zen Buddhism, there's a concept called mu, emptiness that is full of potential. When the cup is empty, it can be filled. When the space is cleared, it can breathe. When you disappear, you are choosing mu. You are becoming the empty cup, not because you are void, but because you are finally ready to be filled with something real. It's in this space that your truest self awakens. No masks, no noise, just presence. There's a quote that says, "Sometimes you have to disappear just to see who will come looking for you." But here's the truth. When you disappear with dignity, you don't wait for anyone to come looking. You're not testing them. You're not baiting anyone. You're simply removing yourself from situations that dishonor your worth and trusting that the right ones will find their way back if they were ever meant to. That's not abandonment, that's self-respect. So what happens next? You build. You learn to be with yourself. You discover that peace isn't a destination, it's the path. You realize that your dignity was never in how loudly you could defend yourself, but in how quietly you chose your well-being. You become unshakable, not because you've hardened, but because you've softened where it matters most, inside. You stop performing, you start being, and when people ask, "Where have you been?" you'll simply smile and say, "I was becoming." As the dust settles and your energy returns, you'll see things clearly for the first time. What once seemed unbearable will now feel like a memory. What once felt like an ending will now feel like a redirection. Because in disappearing, you didn't lose yourself. You found yourself unapologetically, powerfully, and fully. And what you found can never be taken again. Now, something remarkable begins to happen. You start moving differently. You speak less, but your words cut deeper. You show up less, but your presence lands heavier. You give less, but it's worth more. Because when you've disappeared with dignity, you don't come back to prove anything. You come back because your energy now walks in before you do. And so the chapter closes, not with a bang, but with a whisper that changes everything. Peace was always an option. Ready for the final truth? Let's go deeper. The path doesn't end here, it culminates. What happens when silence becomes not just your refuge, but your legacy? Let's walk into the final chapter and unlock the quietest power of all. There comes a point in life where words become hollow, explanations feel like begging, and noise only fuels the chaos. It's in that moment, when you're tempted to react, to fight back, to scream your truth into a world too busy to listen. That silence becomes your sword, your shield, your final, unshakable power. Let them misunderstand you. Let them create their narratives, assign motives, invent stories. Silence isn't weakness. It's the refusal to engage in games that no longer interest your soul. Because at some point, you outgrow the need to be understood. You stop showing up to every battle you're invited to. You stop proving your worth in spaces that couldn't hold your truth even if you screamed it. And you realize the loudest answer is the one you never say. Silence, when rooted in wisdom, is the ultimate flex. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you've said it all with how you live, how you move, how you choose peace over war, stillness over performance, evolution over ego. When you become silent, the world leans in. They wonder, they speculate. And in their wondering, they finally hear something deeper than words, your presence. People feel your absence louder than your protest. They hear your peace echo more clearly than your shouting ever did. The truth is, those who deserve your energy will never need your noise. And those who demand your explanation are usually the ones who refuse to understand anyway. So let them talk, let them gossip, let them assume. And you, let your life speak. Every boundary you've set without yelling, every evolution you've undergone without applause, every glow-up, every transformation, every comeback that required no announcement. They are all part of the loudest answer you will ever give. Silence. It doesn't need punctuation. It doesn't seek validation. It is a complete sentence. And if you've walked with me this far, from quiet withdrawal to dignified boundaries to the power of calm and now into this final stillness, then you already know you are not here to convince. You are here to evolve. The quiet path is not the easiest, but it is the most powerful. And in a world obsessed with being heard, the one who listens, the one who observes, the one who walks in stillness, that one becomes untouchable. So the next time someone pushes your buttons, disrespects your peace, or tries to pull you back into the chaos, smile, breathe, and let your silence echo louder than any scream ever could. Because the truth is, the most profound statement you'll ever make is to say nothing at all. Let silence be your loudest answer. If this message resonated with you, if the silence spoke louder than words, then you are already on the path. Here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we share teachings that don't just inform, they transform. If you're seeking stillness in a noisy world, truth beneath the surface, and peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, subscribe and join a growing sangha of souls walking gently through life, mindfully, consciously, and with heart. May your path be clear, may your silence be strong, and may you always come home to yourself.